Today, we're going to talk about a story of prophecy, a story of tragedy, and honestly, a redemption that is so shocking it literally explains the device that's probably in your pocket right now. It's the story of a company that saw the future with perfect clarity, built it, and then failed completely. This is the story of General Magic.
Okay, just read that quote for a second. It's a dead-on description of the smartphone, right? The personal connection, the idea that you can't live without it. Now look at that date, 1989. This was written almost 20 years before the first iPhone was even a glimmer in anyone's eye. This was the vision of one man, Marc Porat.
And this is where it gets kind of spooky. On the left, you've got a description from Porat's old concept sketches for a project he called Paradigm. He's describing this thin, rectangular device, big touchscreen. And on the right, well, that's a modern smartphone. The similarity is just uncanny, separated by 18 years. And that right there is the central tragedy of General Magic. They were absolutely right, but they were just way, way too early.
So that vision was so powerful, so compelling, that in 1990, Marc Porat actually convinced Apple to spin out his secret project into a brand new company. They called it General Magic. And the mission was simple: build the future he had described.
And to do it, he put together an absolute dream team. I mean, these weren't just great engineers. These were the legends, the wizards who built the original Macintosh. We're talking Bill Atkinson, the guy who created MacPaint; Andy Hertzfeld, the main architect of the Mac operating system; Susan Kare, who designed all those iconic original icons. It was literally like getting the Beatles back together to invent the next big thing. But the legends weren't the whole story. And this is where things get really interesting. It's not just who they were, but who they hired to work for them. A bunch of young, ambitious, and at the time, completely unknown engineers. You had people like Tony Fadell, right, out of college, who would, eventually become known as the father of the iPod and a key designer of the iPhone over at Apple. And sitting just a few desks away from him, another young engineer named Andy Rubin. Yeah, that Andy Rubin, the guy who went on to create Android, the operating system that runs on, most of the phones in the world today? Oh, and just for good measure, working in that very same building was Pierre Omidyar. A few years later, he got an idea for a little online auction site you might have heard of, eBay. The amount of world-changing talent packed into this one tiny failed startup is it's staggering. A former employee put it perfectly. Back in the 60s, a company called Fairchild Semiconductor basically gave birth to Silicon Valley, spawning Intel and a dozen other chip companies. Well, General Magic was the Fairchild of the 90s. It was the common ancestor for the entire mobile revolution. They just had no idea at the time. So this all leads us to the big central problem, right? They had the vision, they had the people. So what went wrong? Well, they were building a 21st century device, but they were stuck in a 20th century world. The world just wasn't ready. I mean, look at this. In 1992, they built a technology called Telescript. The idea was you'd create this little software agent, and you'd send it out into what they called, I'm not kidding, the Telescript cloud. And this little agent would go do your shopping or book a flight for you, and then come back with the answer. They basically invented the concept of AI agents and cloud computing before most of us had even heard of email. But then disaster struck. Remember how Apple was a key investor? Well, their CEO at the time, John Sculley, was sitting on General Magic's board of directors. He was in their meetings, hearing their plans. And while all that was happening, Apple secretly started working on its own handheld device, the Newton. And they launched it a full year before General Magic could get their product out the door. It was an absolute betrayal that just gutted them. And that betrayal, well, it really set the stage for a spectacular collapse. The team had built their prophecy, but they were about to slam headfirst into the reality of the mid-1990s. Okay, so first things first, the price. When their device finally launched in 1994, it cost $800. In today's money, that's about $1,600. I mean, who could afford that for a gadget that nobody even knew they needed? And the world was just missing all the other pieces of the puzzle. There was no real public internet yet, just these slow, expensive dial-up networks. Most regular people didn't even have an email address. The hardware was clunky, the processors were painfully slow, and the batteries, they die after just a couple of hours. The foundation their vision needed to stand on just didn't exist. And here's the absolute craziest part. Even though the product was a complete dud in the market,
The hype was so out of control that General Magic went public in 1995 and was valued at over $800 million. It was the first concept IPO, basically. They were selling the dream, even as the reality was completely falling apart.
So, of course, the company collapsed. It was inevitable. But this is where the story gets good. This is the redemption. The death of General Magic wasn't really an end. It was more like a beginning. The failure of that one company became the fertilizer for an entire industry. Let's start with this number. In its whole life, General Magic sold about 15,000 devices total. By any measure you can think of, that is a complete, catastrophic failure. Just remember that number, 15,000. Now, let's look at the world today. 2 operating systems, Apple's iOS and Google's Android. They run everything. They completely dominate the global smartphone market. Together, they make up something like 98% of every single smartphone on the planet. And here it is. Here's the punchline to the whole story. The key guy behind the iPhone, Tony Fadell, and the creator of Android, Andy Rubin, the 2 people responsible for that 98%, were those 2 young, unknown engineers who sat near each other at that spectacularly failed company, General Magic. I mean, this chart just says it all, doesn't it? On the left, that tiny little sliver, that's General Magic's direct legacy. Their 15,000 sales. And on the right, that's the legacy of its alumni. The people who went on to create the iPod, the iPhone, Android, eBay. We're talking more than 5 billion devices. They failed completely, but somehow they succeeded absolutely. And that's exactly why Forbes called General Magic the most important dead company in Silicon Valley. The most important thing about it wasn't its product, it was its failure. It basically released a generation of brilliant people back into the wild, armed with all the lessons of what not to do. So it all leaves you with this one big question, right? What's the real difference between being a visionary and just being wrong? For General Magic, the vision was spot on. The ideas were the ones that would change the world. The only thing that was different? The timing.